All right, let's jump right into this explainer. We're unpacking a highly controversial documentary today, one that argues World War II wasn't just engineered by rogue dictators, but actually by an elite class of international bankers. We're going to look closely at the claims made in the source material, which presents a radically different version of history. It essentially asserts that the global conflicts of the 20th century were fundamentally driven by corporate greed and a massive desire to protect elite wealth. Now, think about this central mystery the source material tries to answer. After the First World War, Germany was literally penniless. The people were exhausted, and their currency was completely destroyed. So the documentary asks us to consider a pretty big question. How does a nation in that absolute rock-bottom condition suddenly bounce back in just 15 years to build a state-of-the-art military, massive steelworks, and an entire network of autobahns? According to the film, you can only build those things with one crucial ingredient: massive capital investment. And they claim this money didn't just magically appear out of thin air from within Germany. It came pouring in from the outside. To break down this argument, we're going to trace this chronological timeline step by step. We'll start with the profit of war, look at the communist threat, move on to the Versailles opportunity, explore financing the Third Reich, and finally, corporate complicity in WWI. Let's get right into it. Section 1. The profit of war, looking at WWI as a massive financial lesson. So according to the documentary, those late 19th century monopolies, the era of the so-called robber barons, realized something absolutely crucial during the Great War. This first global conflict taught international bankers and industrialists a pretty undeniable truth. War is amazingly good for business. The source points out that companies manufacturing rifles and handguns made colossal fortunes. But even more importantly, the world's richest nations had to borrow staggering sums of money from private merchant bankers just to keep fighting. The film argues that when the war ended and the defense contracts stopped, the financial elite had a total paradigm shift. They realized that global conflict could guarantee decades of high-interest debt repayment. Moving on to Section 2, the communist threat, and how it was viewed as a direct threat to elite wealth. The elite's reaction to the 1917 Russian Revolution is where things really shift gears. The source claims the global ruling class, we're talking royal families and huge industrial titans, was completely terrified of losing their fortunes to Soviet-style communism. Watching the brutal execution of the Russian royal family sent massive shockwaves through the upper echelons of every Western nation. According to the documentary, these elites were desperate to hang on to their money and stop similar uprisings in their own countries. So they didn't view fascism as the enemy. Actually, scratch that. They saw authoritarian, right-wing movements as a highly profitable bulwark, basically a giant protective wall they could control to violently suppress any working-class socialist uprisings. Section 3, the Versailles opportunity, which the film frames as crashing the German economy. Let's look at the end of WWI and the Treaty of Versailles. The documentary points a finger directly at the architects of the treaty, specifically naming corporate lawyers like John Foster Dulles and Alan Dulles, claiming they deliberately imposed a mind-boggling 135 billion marks in war reparations. Even famous economists back then, like John Maynard Keynes, called it a ludicrous sum that was physically impossible to pay off. But the source argues this wasn't just an accident or some mathematical error. It was a highly calculated move to completely sabotage the German economy. And that deliberate economic devastation created a massive vacuum. You've probably heard about the hyperinflation, right? Where the German currency collapsed so hard, people were literally papering their walls with worthless marks. Domestic investors were totally wiped out. Well, the source asserts that this catastrophe was exactly what allowed Wall Street financiers and a new international Illuminati to swoop right in. They were able to buy up controlling shares of Germany's incredibly sophisticated steel mills, coal mines, and factories for mere pennies on the dollar. Section 4. Financing the Third Reich, which is all about building that protective bulwark we talked about earlier. Having bought heavily into the German economy, the source asserts these foreign businessmen now had a huge investment to protect. To do that, they needed a homegrown, ultra-right-wing authoritarian leader who could aggressively expand industry and crush labor movements. And they found that figure in Adolf Hitler. The film maps out this wild transnational network of capital, connecting major American and British financial institutions right to Hitler's rise. For instance, it names Brown Brothers Harriman, along with prominent figures like Prescott Bush and Averell Harriman, alleging they acted essentially as a front, funneling millions to the Nazi Party. It also outlines how Dutch bankers financed the Brown House, which was the very first official Nazi Party headquarters, and even implicates the Bank of England in supporting massive loans to the regime. To really put that into perspective, just listen to this quote from Sir Montagu Norman, the head of the Bank of England at the time. He reportedly argued that lending Nazi Germany 90 million marks might never be repaid, but it would still be less of a loss than seeing the fall of Nazism. The source highlights that he didn't even try to keep his avid support for Hitler a secret, viewing the regime as a completely necessary, fully funded defense mechanism against the Soviets. And here's where it gets even crazier, because the source claims this pro-fascist sympathy wasn't just happening over in Europe. It points directly to the 1934 business plot. This was an alleged secret conspiracy where incredibly wealthy American corporate families funded a private army, with the literal goal of overthrowing President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and installing a fascist dictatorship right in the United States. According to the text, the whole plot only failed because the guy they picked to lead it, Major General Smedley Butler, was actually a genuine believer in democracy and blew the whistle to Congress. Yet, incredibly, the source notes the conspirators were so powerful, they never even faced charges. Which brings us to Section 5, corporate complicity in WWI and what the film calls the phony war. As war finally broke out, the documentary paints a super dark picture of a phony war, where Western multinationals simply prioritized their own profit margins way above any sense of national patriotism. The source makes some absolutely shocking claims about how heavily American corporations were involved in sustaining the Nazi war machine long after the U.S. entered the fight. It asserts that Henry Ford gave personal permission to build the trucks used for the Nazi invasion of France. It claims Standard Oil kept the German Luftwaffe flying by supplying a vital chemical additive through neutral Switzerland. ITT apparently manufactured planes that actively bombed Americans. And Chase and Morgan Banks allegedly just kept their Paris branches operating business as usual under Nazi occupation. Basically, the film argues the Nazi war machine was, in many ways, an American business enterprise. Building on that deeply disturbing premise, the film makes the horrific assertion that the concentration camp network was actually driven by brutal corporate logic. It claims camps like Auschwitz were strategically built in mineral-rich regions like coal basins, specifically to act as highly profitable corporate enterprises. By utilizing forced slave labor, these companies could drastically reduce their production costs, which then maximize profits for the Western businessmen who held investments in German industry. This all anchors back to General Smedley Butler's famous assessment: war is just a racket. A few profit and the many pay. The source uses his exact words to argue that the entire military-industrial complex is, at its core, a cynical, profit-driven machine. According to the documentary, the wealthy elites at the very top engineered things so they could seamlessly fund and sell weapons to both sides. That way, no matter who actually won on the battlefield, their money was completely safe and their profits just kept soaring. So, what does this all mean? It leaves us with a final, highly provocative thought derived purely from the documentary's claims. If, as the source argues, the real winners of the 20th century were the massive transnational corporations and banks that financed the conflicts, we really have to ask, how much of the historical narrative we've been taught was carefully curated by the very people who profited from all that devastation? It's a heavy perspective for sure, but one that absolutely leaves you wanting to look a whole lot closer at exactly where the money flows.